Good evening. My name is Andrew Grantham, and this is the presentation of my master's thesis, The Role of Women in Church Leadership, Exploring Doctrine and Consequence. I'll start by asking a question. Is the church you go to, at the church you go to, are women allowed to fill leadership roles, such as being a deacon, an elder, a pastor, or senior pastor? If you said yes, you are one of about 45% of Americans that go to a church that allows women these roles, or if you said no, you are about the other 55%. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, consider that 54% of American Christians are women, but women only make up 10% of senior pastor positions in American churches. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, there are two competing doctrines that govern the permissibility of women filling church leadership roles: egalitarianism and complementarianism. Now, these two doctrines are in some opposition. The purpose of this paper is to look into what is the consequence of having two doctrines that are prominently featured in our churches in about 50-50 split, but that are opposed. Does it create ambiguity? And if so, what is the effect of that? Or what are the pros and cons of women filling church leadership roles? These are the types of questions that I looked into. Now, what informs these doctrines? Well, there are several things. Both are biblically derived from the Bible and use the similar verses to be able to stake their claims. They just interpret them in different ways. And that's the result of hermeneutics, which is literally trying to define the context of the written word to derive its true meaning. Complementarians take these verses that would limit, like in 1 Corinthians, that say that women should remain silent, and apply them broadly. Whereas the egalitarians are saying that Paul meant these just to that church and not overall. So, which is true? Well, that's a difficult question to answer because there are some inherent limitations in hermeneutics. You can make mistakes. There's also limitations when it comes to revelation. Some things are revealed generally, like creation. There's also special revelation in the Bible, but we know that revelation was very specific. There's things that God has chosen not to reveal to us. There's also limitations in the translations available. When you look at these debated verses, they translate different from version to version. Whereas some Bibles translate word for word, and others translate more thought for thought. Neither is exclusively one or the other. And they all mix and match to try to provide original meaning in the focus that they are aiming for. And then also you have the issue whether something is moral or immoral. And this is a key feature, because if the doctrines speak to a moral issue, then about half of the faith is being deceived right now. And that's very significant. But if they're immoral issues and these doctrines are a matter of preference, then we really need to look long and hard about whether or not it's worth really doubling down on the doctrine if it negatively affects other potentially more important parts of the faith. So with this in mind, I conducted research. Reading was the primary research method. I used search engines with keyword searches to find different studies and commentaries that relate to the topic. I found 25 overall. Some were experimental, others quasi-experimental, and some that were commentaries or opinions of experts. And using both the etic and emic methods, deductive and inductive, through a meta-narrative, explain these findings, and then had discussion and ultimately made some recommendations. Some of the key findings are that gender significantly factors into the perceptions of leadership roles, that role conflict and ambiguity is present in the churches, and that it increases things like burnout, which can include depersonalization, lack of accomplishment, and stress. And then a focus on spiritual gifts was effective at overcoming some of these barriers overall. Now, this is a very brief way of stating the findings, but they can be summed up into two themes. One is that role ambiguity posed negative consequences for the church body, and two, that the definition of leadership within the church was broad overall. Now, when I say that role ambiguity had negative consequences, I mean that in a two-pronged way. One, it increases negative affectivity. Affectivity being someone's perceptions of themselves, or maybe their self-worth. So if your role is ambiguous, then you may not know what you were meant for, or question what you were meant for. A woman may feel called to lead, to be a senior pastor, but if is denied that opportunity, now you have role conflict. What are the consequences of ambiguity and role conflict? In some cases, it leads to negative affectivity, as we'd already mentioned, but that negative affectivity then can lead to more serious things, psychological and health issues such as depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. In a group setting, role conflict and role ambiguity can also negatively impact interdependence or the functionality of a group. Paul uses the analogy in Corinthians again of the church being a body made up of many members. And furthering that analogy, if one member is ailing, suffering from the consequence of ambiguity and role conflict, then the rest of the body also suffers. If you tweak your ankle, you're going to feel that pain, even though it's isolated at the ankle. The same principle may apply broadly to the church. So these are concerns that the church needs to understand and consider. We also found that inequity was systemic throughout the church, regardless of what doctrine it adhered to, and that's a little concerning. On the one hand, it may weaken the argument that role ambiguity and conflict within the church is specifically caused by the divide between these doctrines, which is what I believe by looking at the findings. On the other hand, it may further that point. When you consider that society overall, for many centuries, maintained that women were inferior to men, kind of a patriarchal look at the world, that culture also fed into the church. And similarly, discrimination was present in the church. Now, both doctrines of complementarian and egalitarianism refute that view. Complementarians would say that men and women are equally valuable, just have different roles, whereas egalitarians, inherent in their name, would say that there is more opportunity for equality between the genders. Not that they're necessarily equal, but they have equal access to spiritual gifts. It just depends on God as to whether someone is gifted or not. But both refute patriarchal societies, or at least those that would discriminate against women. But if the conflict exists between the two doctrines, they may not be able to effectively push back against these discriminatory ways that come from the world and allow that foothold to exist inside of the church, which would perpetuate more role ambiguity and role conflict. Now, overall, the findings were not able to specifically list pros and cons of women in church leadership. Some of that's because the data wasn't realizable to women filling church leadership roles. The most analytically rigorous results dealt with church-related organizations, nonprofits, and universities. But we were able to come away with some general recommendations. One, the church should revisit the definition of leadership and start looking at leadership through the lens of followership, which is truly what Christ modeled when he was here on earth, that he was here to serve and not be served. And that notion of followership is not really all that common in today's definitions of leadership. Being able to redefine the leadership to followership continuum could improve role clarity and thus eliminate role ambiguity. The second point is that dialogue on the topic can help mitigate a lot of these concerns, even without addressing or resolving whether complementarianism or egalitarianism is correct. A lot of times when discussions are had in one-way communication from the pulpit, they're just instructive. And it allows churches and church leaders to sometimes hide behind doctrine. Maybe not intentionally so, but it doesn't always allow for dialogue and discussion, for people to express their thoughts, or for church leaders to maintain as open a perspective, because they're trying to present what they believe to be true instead of always critically examining the foundations of their beliefs. Having open discussions and being open to possibilities and how the Spirit is leading in other people's lives to arrive at the truth can only be valuable. And you're not disobedient in questioning doctrine and asking those tough questions. And that's something I would encourage churches to take a look at as they have more discussions on these topics. And lastly would be the prioritization of men for women. And this seems like a no-brainer, but when you consider that women make up just 10% of senior pastor positions, well, that's fewer women going around to be able to mentor others. And if women have historically been marginalized in society, then maybe the church needs to spend a little more emphasis on correcting that imbalance. So in conclusion, I'll wrap up by saying that the church does not benefit from the status quo. Continuing to just exist in our current state and have these two competing doctrines and not have meaningful dialogue to help people understand their underpinnings and how they should relate to them doesn't do anything to narrow the gap caused by the zone of uncertainty and then the ambiguity that people may feel as a result. Secondly, we can't allow the fear of violating doctrine to prevent us from actually applying the wisdom of Christ. What I mean by that is that it's really easy, like I said, to stand behind the doctrine and to say, well, this is what I believe and this is what I've been told, and I'm going to err on the side of caution and say that we shouldn't permit women to fill leadership roles. I don't know if I believe in complementarianism or egalitarianism, frankly. But what I do know is that there's enough doubt here to really start asking that issue. And the question of beneficial, what is worse? Allowing a woman to fill a leadership role because she feels led to, and to pray over that and really confirm that this is where the Spirit has endowed her, or to simply say, no, we don't risk sinning before God by allowing her to fill this position. It's something that churches need to consider, but I would argue that it may be more profitable to take some risks in this regard. And then lastly, everyone's a stakeholder in this. Men and women. I'm a father, a husband. I have 3 sisters. This is a very personal issue to me, because if role ambiguity can negatively impact the lives of my loved ones, such that they could have anxiety, depression, or even eating disorders because they don't feel like they're living up to their full God-given potential, then that's something that I think we all should be working proactively to combat, or at least to understand, to come to a deeper level of understanding so that we can avoid these negative situations, not just for our loved ones, but also for the church at all. Because at the end of the day, what is this about? It's about loving others and loving God, doing all for the glory of God. And that was really the intention and purpose that this thesis was getting after. And that's what I would press on to you and anyone else that reads it, is that take the opportunity to really examine your beliefs, to get together with others and help them examine their understanding of God's purposes, and then work together to lift up others and the body of Christ. So I thank you for this time. I hope you were edified by this presentation. God bless you, and have a great night.